Welcome to the Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothschild.
Well, that's the first time either of us have said those words in a little while. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing very well, Greg. Thank you. Good to be back with you.
All right. So I'm sure our audience knows, we've been away for a few weeks. We've had some, loose ends to sort out. I think, Jeremy, you're still going through some, processes related back to the Plaza Library incident. And, I've been taking these few weeks to just, focus on some personal things. So, we are back in the saddle though.
Yes, very good to be back in the saddle here, riding out on your media landscapes, as we say, turning the tables. And so it was handled some stuff, including putting together a pro se appellant brief, just my wife and me, in place of any lawyers, and in the Eighth Circuit here, which goes everywhere from Arkansas up through your state of Missouri, up through Iowa, and up into the Dakotas, and the whole area there, in relationship to the library arrest case and appealing it on my own behalf. Took a lot of work, and then some other family stuff, but everyone's doing okay, and blessed to be alive and well, and even especially in these most interesting of times, huh, Greg?
Hey, most interesting that's definitely one way to put it. We do live in most interesting times, and, for better or for worse. I mean, we've already had a year where, we've already seen in the first, 8 months of 7.5 months of this year, a almost complete global economic shutdown and a mass pandemic, and, things we couldn't have even begun to foresee. And let's also remember, people thought we were headed towards a new world war the first few days of the year after the assassination of Soleimani. So we've had that as well. And now we're entering into what I would have to say, it seems to me at least, I think I'm pretty safe in saying this. In terms of the scale of possible events, I think this would have to be by far, at least in modern history, certainly as long as I've been alive and as long as you've been alive. And I don't know how far back we could go to find an election, as far as not even so much the election itself, but all of the intrigue, all of the environment and the mood surrounding this upcoming, presidential, election, better or worse. I don't, you could call it a lot of things other than an election, considering that there's a lot of, aspects of it that are anything but actually democratic, so to speak, in the spirit that it's supposed to be. But I certainly haven't. I don't think you have, and I don't know how many people listening have seen. There's a level of uncertainty in so many areas regarding the events of the next few months and where we're headed. And, it's a very, very, as you said, interesting time to be alive. It's a very uncertain time right now because there are so many things that could happen between now and November 3rd or 4th. I have my worst case scenarios that maybe I'll, lay out, maybe not in this show or in a future show. But, regarding the ticket, it's very interesting, Jeremy. About a year or so ago, we did a show where we predicted Kamala Harris would likely be the presidential candidate, as sort of representing an AIPAC ticket. I believe we talked about the names of Harris and Buttigieg. Turns out we were partially correct. Harris is the vice presidential candidate for somebody who I, back in July of 2019, did not see as somebody who would be in this position now, and that would be Joe Biden. So we had it partially correct. So now we've got it set: Trump-Pence versus Biden and Harris. That's how, or at least as it plays out today, our 2020, quote, election, end quote.
And up until basically the day of the announcement by Biden of his vice president select, I thought that it was actually heading towards Susan Rice as the sort of most obvious selection in terms of a Obama administration working kismet, a perceived seriousness in the establishment around issues of foreign policy, Russia, for example. But it does look like another avenue was sought, and the avenue that we sort of perceived in relationship between these sort of new figures in the presidential political realm of Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg as fairly obvious icons of some way of AIPAC, of the Israel lobby, especially in conjunction with the full-on rise of identity primary politics. And I would just say it like that, and because all politics are based on somewhat in terms of identity. So the sort of derogatory term of identity politics is a little bit overblown, I think, because it misunderstands that all politics somehow deal in who you perceive yourself to be, who you see yourself in common with, how you see yourself as different and all of that. But it's pretty obvious that the Democrats at the very least, and I would actually argue that we've talked about this since the beginning of the Trump administration, that Trump Republican politics are highly identity politics heavy in some level, in a way that's usually just talked about by aspects of the woke left. But I think it's highly serious and very much there.
I would say it's a combination. Yeah, there's like a multiple dynamics or dimensions of identity politics, whereas on one hand, you do play to the fears and, in many cases, either conscious or subconscious prejudices of your largely, conservative Caucasian, voting base, while at the same time also, while there's a lot of race aspects to this, and there is obviously the operation going on with the African American population, the idea of leave the plantation of the Democratic Party and come to the Republicans who are about true freedom and justice for all human beings. Of course, you realize when you even take like a minute look at things that that's a crock of shit. But I digress. But so there's a lot of identity politics going on with, I think, primarily based around playing upon the fears of the, of your largely Caucasian voting base. And it's pretty fascinating how on one hand and I hear Rush Limbaugh do this, and I might talk about this in a few minutes, this dynamic of talk radio and like the right wing echo chamber. But it's amazing how somebody like Rush Limbaugh, I've listened to way too much of him lately, unfortunately, can simultaneously dog whistle to the fears and prejudices of his, listener base, which is very largely white Caucasian, and at the same time, portray himself and the Republicans as the champions of, who are against the real racists and bigots, which are the Democrats. So you have this large, very racial, identity politics, but also you have a conspiratorial identity politics at play as well, where everything is a vast conspiracy against Donald Trump and everything that's good about conservative American values.
And now what we know in terms of, and actually some of this is actually even further drawn out in a highly explicit fashion in relationship to this recent release, I think yesterday, right, of the Volume 5 report from the Senate Intelligence Committee about the Trump-Russia investigation, really, the Russia investigation as they call it, that part of the dynamics of what was being done in relationship to something like psychometric warfare outfit Cambridge Analytica, that looks like it was actually constructed as part of the run-up to the 2016 election, right, by the Mercer-Bannon network, including this link into where it was created over there in the UK, Cambridge University, this Russian-based scientist, data scientist Kogan, who was the one who originally got the data from Facebook via apps that were basically taking psychometric results of people on Facebook. And he was it's well recognized, that, and we've mentioned this before, that there's this interface there, obviously, not only with the Bannon and the Mercers from the U.S. political sphere, but then also Kogan was working with, for the Russian government for certain things. And what's so interesting about it too is that it's said to be in the relationship of something like, crime. I have this part of the, report pulled up, because I think this is very relevant to what you said about the idea of the way that the the sort of what is seen or called the conspiracy theorist. And I think I've mentioned this before, but even back towards the days of like street actions when at We Are Change LA, we were aware of the idea of the person who was playing the role of the conspiracy theorist, the guy with the fisherman hat on, with the sunglasses, with the sort of always connecting, whatever, crop circles to chemtrails to 9/11 all in one riff, yelling in one riff. It's that kind of thing.
I think we've all been to events where the random person will come up and start ranting about chemtrails in an event that has nothing to do with chemtrails. I think we've all seen that before. So
right, and that of course is putting aside my own personal take on the epistemology of geoengineering and so-called chemtrails per se, right? And chemtrails, to me, just even the phrase, of course, was weaponized from the beginning, similarly to the way that 9/11, rather than September 11th, talked about that before, about how 9/11 takes the event out of history and turns it and hooks it up in the mind with the reptilian brain of 911 and of numerology rather than of a place in the calendar and history. So all of these kinds of, so putting aside the question of the political epistemology of all of these things, even crop circles or whatever, all these kinds of things, all the way UFOs, everything, but the idea of creating a sort of sauce, a bouillabaisse of conspiracy theory is really sort of the point of the way that kind of meme is weaponized in general. And so this idea that the someone who could be considered a conspiracy theorist or something like that was identified via these kind of psychometrics investigations by scientists such as Alexander Kogan, who worked directly with the Russian government and then worked directly with a UK special forces born psychological warfare military grade operation, SCL group, that then spawns via interface and purchasing of people like billionaire Robert Mercer and his henchman Steve Bannon, and then deployed into the U.S. as Cambridge Analytica, that this is exactly what the kind of thing that they were doing. These were the kind of identities, self-identities, self-perceptions that they were doing in a highly data-driven fashion, okay? And I would just even point out that things like the rise of flat Earth, I would say I bet you could figure out, if someone drilled down on it, and you knew how to do data metrics and psychographic research, you would be able to see the specific rolling out of flat Earth, especially in relationship to maybe even something like, maybe the anti-Jewish right at some level. And you could see that there was there was a constellation there that was maybe constructed. At the very least, it was catalyzed, and it was catalyzed probably in a run-up to something like 2016. Okay, so that's just my hypothesis, but there is data that is out there that suggests that something like that was in place. And you and I, Greg, even have, people that we know who are 9/11 activists and all of that, who we've seen, especially those who are, we've seen the way that Facebook seems to, okay, it's we've seen correlation. We don't know if it's necessarily causation, but I'm beginning to understand the explanatory factors here of those who seem to interface with Facebook in a certain way at a certain scale of their time and energy and political investment that seem to have been caught up directly, seem to have been perfectly targeted by these kinds of identity politics at some level, in the way that it was worked on in terms of this ongoing 11/9 operation.
Yes, and in terms of Facebook, I want to throw in Facebook being so key to this. I mean, Facebook is like the key social media area as far as like Cambridge Analytica style propaganda warfare was largely, primarily done through Facebook. And there's some questions I think that, need to be answered regarding the relationship of Mark Zuckerberg to this Russian oligarch by the name of Yuri Milner, and how whatever went on with Zuckerberg and Milner and financial transactions that took place when Zuckerberg may have been in a rough patch economically as far as, Facebook's future being in question. And these events that have gone on over the last, 6 to 8 years or so. So there's stuff there with, that needs to be figured out with Mark Zuckerberg's role in all this, with Facebook obviously being, I'd say, the key social media propaganda, platform for a lot of this, so much of this.
Definitely. I had to wheel back there to get some books because that just reminded me of the that the whole analysis of the background of big data, big tech companies like Facebook or Google, right, is of course it's Silicon Valley. Its roots obviously in the U.S. military industrial complex and the security services, all the way from the Cold War on up. And so there is that analysis that's crucial, I think, to the background here that would even include someone like Yasha Levine, who's pretty much, it seems to me, fairly blind on the reality and the escalation and the importance of such foreign dynamics as like Russia and Israel and all of this. But at the same time, his book Surveillance Valley, about the background of the internet as basically a counterinsurgency weapon of some sort, is important to factor in. And so then you take that into the 21st century, into the rise of big data, most especially in terms of these twin pillars of that, I would say, which is Google and Facebook, right? Google as like the individual's access to information, the data that's out there, even like Google Earth, right, comes directly, apparently, out of a National Geospatial Agency contracted mapping programs like Keyhole. But both Facebook and Google obviously have some deep U.S. national security intelligence background, of course, and then In-Q-Tel was what popped into my mind when you were talking about this whole question of Yuri Milner, right? And how interesting that then becomes in terms of this obvious, there's obviously that's a Russian network there with Milner. And the way he came into Silicon Valley, everybody was like, oh my gosh, who is this sort of like sort of semi-gangstery Russian billionaire, just sort of shows up on scene and starts purchasing everything, purchasing shares in all these big companies. He basically, I think he, bought up like the biggest house on the West Coast or, something like that. So you have In-Q-Tel, right, which is seen as the investment arm, or it is the investment arm of the CIA, right? But then post 9/11, one of those key brothers who are at the epicenter of like at the juncture, it looks like, of like the Israeli security state and the U.S. security state's data structure. And I'm trying to remember the guy's name. It was in Bolin's book. That's why I went to go get it. Do you remember who I'm talking about, Greg?
Not off the top of my head, I don't.
The Yaron, the Yaron brothers, right? And Amit Yaron, I think that's his name, right? Who was basically the cyber czar for the Pentagon in the run-up to September 11th. And then he's sort of the head of Homeland Security, cyber post 9/11, I think. And then after that, he becomes the head of In-Q-Tel, right? And so I think that that network there, which is very much Israeli intelligence, there's a direct Guardian connection to the Yaron family network, and that is Guardian of any of these sort of like investment outfits is basically, it's a front of Israeli intelligence. It's not even a front. It is Israeli intelligence's investment arm out in the world. And so to me, that begins to point to how it's not simple about who these investors are, or in these investment arms are of these companies that, from a sort of simplistic, maybe left perspective, can be called, this is just the, U.S. military industrial complex. If so, then why do we have obvious Israeli agents of some sort, of some Israeli intelligence network, or Russian intelligence agents of some sort in relationship to someone like Yuri Milner so involved in this, allowed to be so involved in this. And so then it begins to sort of touch back on these deeper historical areas where we're beginning to go in terms of trying to understand this, where basically at this point, my sense is it's over 90% likely that someone like Henry Kissinger is a long-term, some kind of Soviet agent, like a direct Soviet agent. Someone like James Angleton, to me, looks like there's reason to believe that for some reason he became, he was obviously an Israeli partner, right? He controlled the Israel desk. Some of the investigations I'm doing in some of the books that I've received now, you talk about how when he was on his way out and William Colby came in to direct the CIA and just had a horrible time trying to deal with the wake of Angleton's wreckage in counterintelligence and really how it affected all of U.S. intelligence. And Angleton's controlling not only counterintelligence for basically the main portion of the post-World War II era, the rise of the Cold War, but he's also controlling the Israel desk. And then Colby comes in, and Angleton has a very, very peculiar and unique setup in terms of how all the information from the entirety of like the Middle East is basically filtered through him. Somehow it's basically through his position at the head of the Israel desk, but then it's also then is his relationship to being the head of counterintelligence. Okay. So my sense is that the parameters are there, even including like, I've mentioned this before, that it looks like there's only a sort of a handful of people who've really made this allegation publicly about Angleton being a potential Soviet asset over the longer term. And it's a combination of Claire Petty, who was the actual counterintelligence officer who was tasked by Angleton to try to find the mole. And then it's the journalist, what's his name?
Not Valentine.
Yes, Douglas Valentine.
Douglas
correct.
Valentine.
Right. And so even in the books of like people like who are potential like poo-pooers of any of that, like people like Tom Mangold, who wrote the book Cold Warrior, James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's master spy hunter. There's little bits of, in the midst of when he's, trying to sort of pass over or knock down the investigation by Claire Petty. He basically, mentions just a couple little what are seen as factoids, but things of like where Angleton, when he's on his way home from one of the first ever, I think it's like a NATO intelligence chiefs meeting, and it's in Australia. Maybe it's a Five Eyes intelligence chiefs meeting. That on the way home from that, it's the first ever of that. On the way home from that, he basically charters a private flight, it looks like, and then he stops off in Mexico City for some unknown reason, and then the date lines up exactly with a high-level Soviet intelligence chief also being in Mexico City, and then Mangold just sort of waves that all away by basically saying that's just a coincidence, or something like that. So, but I think it's very, very, to me, it's very, very interesting, and I'm highly convinced at this point that this kind of transnational or this level of compromise at the heart of things that are seen as the U.S. national security complex, military, industrial complex, the intelligence services, thinking of people like Angleton and Kissinger, can you think of like two more substantive high-level figures that can be said to be at the commanding heights of U.S. Cold War, national security policy? It's hard to, name them actually, other than maybe go back to the Dulles brothers, who are also, in the mix in all of these dynamics. But I began to, think that that this kind of compromised and complex dynamics, especially in a post-World War II Cold War kind of way, is the rule, not the exception. So I begin to sort of understand someone like a Yuri Milner and the trip of Mark Zuckerberg to Russia and these very strange, dynamics in terms of then the way that Facebook was then tapped via a Russian data scientist, Kogan, and then fed via Mercer and Bannon into a weapon against the minds of dozens of millions of American people in the 2016 election, that this is not something sort of out of nowhere, but this is at some level the fruit of a long-term poisonous rooted tree.
Yes, I'm going to go back to that. By the way, the name you were referring to, I believe, is Amit Yoran.
Amit Yoran, thank you.
Yes, Amit Yoran. He was the National Cybersecurity Division Director within the U.S. Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you. Yes, that's and there's he has a brother too, and Yoran, to me, this is what I've said, and I believe this is true, that it looks like Yoran was sheep dipped into the U.S. military, and he graduated from West Point. And then is recognized as one of the great data officers in the U.S. military. And yet he's so obviously some kind of interface with Israeli military intelligence also.
Yes, and so what you were laying out there, Jeremy, is a lot of, it's what you laid out there going back to Angleton and some of the operations, some of the Cold War style intrigue we're really looking into that I think we're going to be hammering here in some future episodes. The Angleton Kissinger dynamic. There's also not a lot of other aspects related to this, interrelated with this, that go into the era of Iran-Contra and just a lot of things we've been looking into that I think from a long-term perspective, fit very much into what we're kind of seeing with this, what you're talking about with like this, this information warfare aspect of the 2016 operation that was so crucial to it and that is still obviously going on now. You could say even things like in the COVID-19 era has been ramped up to a new level of, there's so much, because it seems like things just keep reaching different levels as far in terms of like, the scopes of like, as far as like, of this type of, psychological operations and these, in terms of propaganda warfare and all this and that. And so we're laying out like what is a long-term continuum on a number of multiple levels. And in the coming months, I think we want to try and, relay this information and try to make sense of it as much as we possibly can. And I wanted to go back to one more point made about what we're talking about with Yuri Milner and Facebook and the Russian aspect of Cambridge Analytica, because a lot of people like to see, associate Cambridge Analytica with Breitbart, right? And of course, Breitbart equals Israel, made in America, conceived in Israel, Breitbart seen as an Israeli mouthpiece. But when you look at this aspect of the Russian, of a very large, very important Russian aspect to the Cambridge Analytica warfare operation, and even something like Milner, Zuckerberg, Facebook, whatever goes on with Facebook becoming the leading, social media purveyor of this type of warfare, you see that very much when you add the Russian aspect. There's even somebody like Michael Flynn who fits in with another one of these long-term, maybe perhaps Israeli Soviet nest type operatives, of course, that being Michael Ledeen. Even some of the involvement of Michael Flynn at SCL Group Cambridge Analytica figures into this. But you can see where, Breitbart, the website that's made in Israel with all, ostensibly pushing like the, Israeli goals in the Middle East and in that part of the world, as well as global policies that would be favorable to Israel and particularly to the Netanyahu Likud government, can ultimately work hand in glove with a lot of Russian goals and geopolitical goals, international goals that very much match up with the goals of particularly the very hawkish wing of the global Zionist movement, and ultimately where so many of these goals and meet up and ultimately can be in a very harmonious way. Like, for example, the mutual disdain of international institutions, which I think is at the heart of a lot of what's been going on in Western Europe over the years with Brexit, the rise of the pseudo right-wing populism in Europe, and which of course culminated with the presidency and the election of Trump. So in the coming weeks and months, I think we're going to make as concerted of an effort as our unorganized selves can possibly make to trying to make sense of a lot of this from a long-term perspective and from a current election perspective. And did you want to add anything? Because I know you were going to read an excerpt from, I believe, this new Senate report on Russia in 2016 that came out.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts in my mind in terms of all of this, both historically, because I would like to get into this, some of the actual data in this report. And I would just say that I believe this report, this we've been talking about how like the counterintelligence aspect of 2016 is crucial in terms of understanding what actually happened, right? And so I would say for anyone who sort of didn't quite get to or get through the Mueller report, I myself didn't get all the way through it. I moved through parts of it, and we reported on little pieces of it that thought were really interesting, that we thought maybe other people might not report upon. But there was a sense of the limited scope of it. And it was not just limited because it was limited by Rod Rosenstein, as I think we've pointed out potentially, that Rosenstein, who now is apparently has a legal contract to represent the interests of Israeli military intelligence firm, the NSO Group. And so this is the guy who wrote the scope for the Mueller investigation, the Trump-Russia investigation. So he controlled the scope of it at some level. And it's not to say that the investigators, including Mueller at the helm, couldn't have, if they showed cause, gone wherever they needed to in terms of, criminal indictments and things like that, right? Except for, obviously, in relationship to someone who's a sitting president, because the Department of Justice has some kind of, that even if he shot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue, you couldn't indict a sitting president, right? So there's a certain kind of
or in the case of the alternative media, the Q followers, if Trump were to do something illegal, sexually illegal against a 13-year-old, nobody can indict him. So,
right, if there were actually video of an actual event in the 90s of where Trump and Epstein were involved in something like that, and there was video evidence of that, then I guess under this Department of Justice and Q, I don't know. I would hope that if the Q people...
Deep fake, Jeremy.
I'm sure deep fake would be the first one, but if it were shown to be actual legitimate video of Trump raping a teenager, my sense is the actual sort of patriots in the Q movement would not back that blindly. But that's just my faith. That's just my faith, okay? And so there is some sort of inherent conundrum of the Mueller investigation, which was inherently a criminal investigation, right? And this, of course, is the way that everyone from mass criminal cover-up CIA operative Bill Barr, the Iran-Contra cover-upper extraordinaire, to even people like, supposedly on the left, like Aaron Mate, could use the very legally determined line of that conspiracy was not established. Remember that? That's the line. The conspiracy was not established in relationship to Trump-Russia, right? And that singular phrase even was then spun by Barr before he, remember this, he gave his like little, footnotes, his little, yellow book on the Mueller report a month before I think he actually released it. And so he would Barr picked out these phrases to basically say, no conspiracy was established. And so that is the origins at some level of no collusion, I've seen no collusion, right? So that is there was lots of collusion. Actually, and you go read this counterintelligence report from the Senate, who people like Marco Rubio uncomfortably released that, and basically Marco Rubio did his best Bill Barr impression after having had to have released this report by basically once again, reiterating that there was no collusion, whereas the report shows tons of collusion.
Amazing how all the swamp dwellers like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham are all constantly when push comes to shove, ultimately protecting and defending the Trump operation just about every way, shape, and form imaginable. Kind of funny how that works.
It is kind of funny.
I guess we're supposed to hate Romney and John Kasich and just like either not think about the rest of them, but not here at the Antidote.
So before we get into this report, I just want to maybe hint at some of these other historical frameworks and explorations that we've been looking into that you also hinted at, Greg, in terms of there's a book that I've found that I've heard referenced before called Compromised: Clinton, Bush, and the CIA by Terry Reid and John Cummings that has some very interesting things in it about the core of Iran-Contra. But what I'm thinking about is even these events that are seen as exposing the U.S. deep state and the CIA, such as, for example, in the middle of Iran-Contra. And this, we won't go deep into this now, but just want to touch on this as a potential framework of the downing of the CIA plane. I think it was in 1986. We found a New York Times article titled U.S. Agency Used Plane Lost in Nicaragua by Richard Halloran from October 10th, 1986. And of course, this is like the epicenter of, Barry Seal, right? This is when that it was exposed that the CIA was like running the cocaine and the Contras and the whole of that scenario, right? And there is bits and pieces in this book from someone very close who was in that operation, right? That there was evidence that had been staged at some level. It was caused to happen. It was caused to expose the operation by others. And there are hints of the Soviet realm. The Israelis are deeply involved in the whole thing and monitoring. And, we've talked about that before. So I just want to say that things like that, where there's a sort of simplistic understanding of that event as just a full-on exposure, an unexpected exposure, an eruption of the sort of U.S. deep state, and so that it could be, had to be understood by the mainstream. Or even something like, just ran into very recently in, reading through this Henry Kissinger's Soviet Agent book. And of course, all of these books have their own perspectives from their own, people. And so this is the thing that we always work to do here at the Antidote is I wouldn't say there's a single source in the entire world that I trust for everything, or for anything per se, However, basically most to all sources, you can find something that if you source it from multiple backgrounds, or let's say you do some meta-analysis of understanding what was actually going on historically, then you can actually draw out things that have been missed before.
In many cases, you could take a diverse, wide variety of sources from, all over the ostensible political spectrum, quote left, quote right, quote center. And really, if you know what you're looking for and you can find buzzwords and know certain things to look for, you can find where a lot of these outlets and publications and writings are ultimately, maybe not even directly, but ultimately are reinforcing some of the things you're finding in these ostensibly polar opposite areas that are ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're really looking closely, are reinforcing these same ultimate historical narratives.
Yes, and I also would just say that I think that is something that we, I don't know how intentional this was for us, but I think one of the things that we attend to and work to do well is that we pay attention to not only a wide range of politically backed media or political perspectives, and we've talked about that before in terms of the monitoring of these large array of media that we pay attention to and attempt to analyze, not only for the information that's being presented, but the meta perspective or the propaganda that is being presented by that, or that's being unspoken of that. So not only that, in terms of taking in multi-sources, in terms of perspective, but also taking in multimedia too, sort of like the intersection of different kinds of media. Some of this is intergenerational stuff too, in terms of, not only paying attention to print, or not only paying attention to a certain kind of print, either, online or book or article, but then also dealing with things like oral media, podcasts. You're always sending me links to Frank Gaffney's podcast. This is where we pick up on things like, David Wurmser making, of any singular voice in the, American system, being very sort of open about what that aspect, is thinking in relationship between especially Israel and Iran,
Frank Gaffney.
Yes. Or all the way to video and looking into documentaries. And so I just want to put in a pitch for that kind of multimedia, multimodal approach to sense-making, truth discovery, analysis that I think really not only helps you understand context better, but it actually can help you get to the truth of the matter by understanding the context better. And so I brought up this Henry Kissinger book, so this Henry Kissinger, Soviet Agent by Frank A. Capel, which is obviously from a, it's sort of on the edge, it's sort of semi-John Birchy at some level, but there's a lot of data, there's a lot of hard facts in there that can be sourced. And so things such as where, the break-in to Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office that has always been seen as basically, just proof of the out of control criminality of the Nixon administration and the fear of the U.S. deep state of the most dangerous man in America, Ellsberg. And I even think it was Kissinger, wasn't it? I believe it was potentially, it was either Nixon or Kissinger that was said to have given Ellsberg that name. But then this book brings in some interesting information that basically that this was done by Kissinger in order to poison the prosecution against Ellsberg. And so, not there yet in terms of, I'm there with it's obvious Pollard was taken down, and the way he was taken down was to protect a much wider, much higher level complex of Soviet-Israeli moles of some sort in that context, right? The Mr. X Committee, which, by the way, and not coincidentally, involved also what we're beginning to identify as the horseshoe internally at the Rand Corporation, where you have the Woolsteaders, who are seen as very obviously part of the sort of the hawkish Pollard network interests at the Rand Corporation, by the way. And then also you have the dovish Ellsbergs who expose something in a very specific way for very specific interests, that whether or not the consciousness of Ellsberg himself, and maybe he's just, that he is a mole or a spook of some sort. It may not be. It may be that he's being utilized, his sentiment is being utilized. But, there's that at the very least, the structural dynamics seem to play over and over of these internalized horseshoes of the sort of hawks and the doves in a controlled dialectic in many ways, both internally and externally. And you pointed out, Greg, that if this is the case, and it looks like this is, this is the case, meaning Kissinger himself is a dirty operator beyond just being a dirty U.S. imperialist, right? That there's something else beyond that also going on potentially, or he's playing the role of a dirty U.S. imperialist in relationship to this other higher role potentially that he's playing. Kissinger is basically playing both sides. Kissinger at the epicenter of the holding off of the actual potential making of a peace deal in Vietnam in relationship to the election and Nixon and all of that. And we went into some of that background, I think, Greg, in relationship to when we were dealing with the Sirhan, the RFK assassination, General Dynamics, Anna Chenot.
I forget when exactly we dealt with that, but yes, it was, basically Kissinger was key to sabotaging peace talks that could have led to an end of the war in Vietnam, war in Southeast Asia prior to Nixon's election and taking office, and which resulted in the prolonging of the war. And what we were talking about earlier among ourselves when you sent me this information about Kissinger and Ellsberg is that what this would mean was that not only was Kissinger at the center of an operation, a purposeful, deliberate effort to sabotage a possible ending of the war in Vietnam, and not only that, but an escalation because it escalated under Nixon, and ultimately that continued to perpetuate and escalate the anti-war student protests, which continued to contribute to the massive domestic division of the 1960s and early 70s. But then also Kissinger playing a key role in actually aiding and propagating the case of Daniel Ellsberg, the man who blew the whistle on this report on the war that made the United States look really bad. So,
right. So sort of like playing all of these elements together here, and it is very interesting that you're right that it not only was it prolonged under Nixon, it was escalated in Vietnam, right? And that was when the era of the talk, where it was supposedly credible, talk of nuclear bombs and being used in Vietnam by Nixon, right? And so what's interesting too is that this book, Henry Kissinger's Soviet Agent, it also points out that Kissinger, when he was going and looking for reports from the Rand Corporation, that the one specific report that he was very, very interested in, and I'm trying to find it here precisely. I remember it generally. I'll just say what it was generally. Was that he was looking for reports that the Rand Corporation. Oh, here it is. I found it on page 68. Okay. Here it says, quote, these. In one instance, Kissinger sought from the Rand Corporation data on how atom bombs could be used against Egypt on behalf of Israel without involving the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is very interesting because also remember that Rand is the epicenter of like Dr. Strangelove, right? And so that's, again, that's interesting background there in terms of Hollywood and national security, which is deeply at play in a lot of this even too, because you got to remember also there's this book about the Rand Corporation. It's like the only biography of the Rand Corporation that I'm aware of. That's called Soldiers of Reason, The Rand Corporation and the Rise of the American Empire by Alex Abella. That there's little pieces of it that talk about the background of Wohlstetter and his house in the Hollywood Hills, and you go look at it, it looks like, sort of these sort of effete, sort of avant-garde intellectuals hanging out in these modern 20th century houses in the Hollywood Hills. And then last night I began to piece this together, that yes, this is also, right, thinking about the work of Dave McGowan in terms of Laurel Canyon and Lookout Mountain, that there's a U.S. Air Force, CIA full films facility up in Laurel Canyon. All of the 60s, and 70s music, counterculture, the musicians, and the actors, and especially the musicians, they all are the sons and daughters of military intelligence, right? And this facility, the Lookout Mountain facility, is said to be also at the epicenter of things like Kissinger's mind control program, and I haven't done a deep background. I mentioned the Bryce Taylor book, Thanks for the Memories, before. I found it intriguing. I saw that Robert David Steele, like just a few days after we published that, basically tried to just quickly debunked that book totally in favor of only the Transformation of America book. So I thought that was sort of interesting. That was just a note that I made. But that book puts the Lookout Mountain, it looks like.
The less said about he who wants to collaborate with Jerome Corsi, the better.
Oh yeah, and hooking Jerome Corsi up with Cynthia McKinney, the better. Yeah, Oh boy, dude. Okay, that's a whole
Although
nother.
we probably will, we might actually visit that in the future. We'll see.
Well, we probably should, but yeah. But that's an aside for now. But I just noticed that because it is interesting if you think about that film studio. It's overtly involved in mind control, at least propaganda of some sort, right? It's involved with the creation of film in the nuclear age. And supposedly all of the who's who of the big actors worked on secret projects there, including Marilyn Monroe. And there's a whole thing there, right, in terms of Marilyn Monroe in the midst of, thinking about just even this sort of Trump era swamp, the deep state, the inversion of the deep state, national security apparatus and mob ties. That's not new, right? That goes way back too. Even thinking about, the Rat Pack, right? Sort of, and even thinking about how it's called, right? Isn't Mnuchin's company, it's sort of titled after that at some level, right? The Dune
Rat Pack
Dune.
Rat Pack Entertainment, yes.
Brett Ratner.
By the way, Steve Pachenik's favorite cabinet member, along with Wilbur Ross, the mobbed up Hollywood guy and the mobbed up Rothschild bankruptcy specialist.
He did. Pachenik shouted out. He's like, "Look, Alex, I know he's surrounded by all these swamp dwellers, but the two that I really like are Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross." He said that.
And his favorite public official is Ron. Let's immediately go over to Florida as governor and sign an anti-BDS legislation after I sponsored the recognized Golan Heights as Israel resolution in the House, along with Jim Jordan with whatever information is being used against him with regards to the Ohio State wrestling scandal. So anyway, a little quick diversion there on Pachenik, considering that we talked about him so much in our last live stream. Oh, and you heard Pachenik praising Cuba under Batista with Meyer Lansky running wild. So
right, and so this is that Meyer Lansky network, right? It existed back then. It existed in relationship to the dynamics of the Rat Pack in Hollywood back then, and it apparently is the next generations of that is apparently deeply involved still in Hollywood and politics in relationship to Rat Pack Dune Entertainment, it looks like to me. And so just finishing this thought about the what I realized in relationship to this, biography of the Rand Corporation, that, the Woolsteaders have set up their shop up there in the hills of Hollywood, maybe even in Laurel Canyon. I can't remember exactly. But at the very same time as the rise of Lookout Mountain and the rise of obviously what some kind of dynamics of some aspect of MK Ultra and mass mind control and cultural operations, mass cultural operations of things like obviously what they were doing in terms of apparently generating culture, music culture, political culture, in a way that obviously served some kind of function. And so I think if you read those two together, actually Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and The Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream by Dave McGowan, and then Soldiers of Reason, The Rand Corporation and the Rise of the American Empire by Alex Abela, you can begin to sort of understand this relationship. And, I'll just take it back again. The theater of war, the war of theater, right? Theatrics of war. And so this is something I think that we need to understand, especially like with the rise of the Cold War, especially where you have this intense, the consequences are so serious if you think about it in terms of mutually assured destruction, thermonuclear war, more generally in terms of where people at the Rand Corporation like Herman Kahn are trying to make the case in a so-called reasonable manner for why nuclear war is inevitable. It'd be best to sort of figure out a way to preempt it. Or as Winnep guy Patrick Clausen might say, how we can get the U.S. president to nuclear war with the Soviet Union, right? I mean, that would be sort of that generation's version of Patrick Clausen, talking about how to get, Obama to war with Iran, really, on C-SPAN. But that you basically, these people, this is the Rand Corporation where they are theorizing these kinds of Megadeth, the consequences of that we should be able to absorb the destruction of dozens of millions of the American people, and not to mention Soviet people, Russian people, or people around the world in the middle of that. So in the middle of something like that, like a Cold War where the consequences are being asserted and imagined in a way where dozens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people would die worldwide, you can imagine that something like intelligence and penetration and moles and having people at the highest levels over generations, that of course is going to be happening, and that things like theatrics, like a theater, putting on a show in public, becomes what's seen as the more viable and less deadly option than actual confrontation. And so I just want to throw that into the mix. And then finally, just to sort of link that up with what we're trying to work out about this strange dynamic of these, what we see, we're meant to see as these sort of hardest nosed, hardline hawks who, just like the way that, the sort of the escalation of the Vietnam War was done potentially by someone who was not really actually interested in winning the war, or even the sort of the specific consequences or benefiting directly from the escalation of war in the personage of Henry Kissinger, but that sort of role was being played for some kind of intelligence-based subterfuge reason of some sort. And so I think we want to begin to suss some of that stuff out, especially in relationship to like these neocon networks and these people like the sort of like the Frank Gaffneys and the Ladines and the new China Hawks and all of that, and how the people who are meant to be seen as the hardest nosed and the most aggressive at some way are actually playing a role that looks like it's actually meant to benefit the potentially worst elements of the quote unquote enemy itself.
Yes, it's very amazing, and we're going to be doing some. I intend on doing some deep dives in the coming weeks and months into several of these dynamics, and I'll add I'll be relatively quick here. Two things on to what all you said there, and then we can move into finally getting somewhat into this Senate report, and then we can maybe end by shifting back into maybe 2020 election talk. But I want to throw in two, we try to be relatively quick here, points on to follow up on what you were saying there. It's very interesting, if I had been approached with this or told this a year or so ago, you have three possible major events with what appears more and more to be, maybe fall guys, so to speak. And one of them, I think the most obvious, Oliver North. A lot of people consider Oliver North and pretty much know Oliver North was a fall guy for more powerful interests in the whole Iran-Contra affair. Another one would be Jonathan Pollard, and it definitely appears, very, very strong case that the same was the case with Pollard. Pollard was a fall guy for a much larger operation going on around him. And now the third name I'm going to throw in here with, maybe it's not quite so much a fall guy scenario, but it's a similar dynamic at play with, Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and this Kissinger role that you're uncovering here. And if somebody had told me a year ago that, look, you can make sense out of Pollard and Oliver North, right? Perhaps representing many of the same interests. But then if you're to throw in like some type of extended operation where Daniel Ellsberg in some way, shape, or form in the anti-war Pentagon Papers, the face of the the document of the anti-war movement, are somehow like even through some deep, convoluted way, all interconnected at some level or another. A year or so ago, I would have said you're crazy. But now it's like you cannot completely dismiss this. And it also, I think in some ways, maybe it becomes full circle when you think about somebody like a young Alan Dershowitz, representing young Senator Mike Gravel from Alaska when he runs into legal problems proceeding from Gravel reading the Pentagon Papers to a session of the U.S. Senate. And of course, what does Alan Dershowitz tell you 4.5 decades later on C-SPAN? Oh, I know nothing about Russia and Israel's continuum. They're on opposite sides in Syria. This is ridiculous and absurd. So it's...
Thank you for reminding me of that, Greg. That, and we then began to draw out then how there's this parallel then of Dershowitz is on the scene there at that previous generation's, and this, of course, is where Dershowitz has his public pedigree of where he's a civil rights lawyer, right? He's a stalwart for the First Amendment, right? And so in that previous generation's, our debate over transparency and leaks, as it would now be called in the 21st century, right? That was previously the Pentagon Papers. That was where a lot of even the questions of case law and stuff about publishing secrets and stuff comes from, right? Especially in relationship to what's perceived as anti-war or exposing government wrongdoing. And then the next, of course, the big 21st century of that is WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, who, by the way, Alan Dershowitz also was early in representing, right, Greg?
Yes, he was, at least for a period of time, involved with the WikiLeaks defense team. And Dershowitz, I believe, to this day, as recently as a year ago, he's been publicly advocating for the right of WikiLeaks as far as publishing and putting out information. So and that was, I believe, the last time I heard Dershowitz talk about WikiLeaks was actually on an RT interview on the program Going Underground with Rafshin Atanzi. So that was about a year or so ago. But it's interesting, Dershowitz, everything that, he's the ultimate First Amendment free speech attorney, right? He represents the unpopular people in the case of, in the spirit of Tom, he's a modern day Thomas Paine or a modern day, I forget, was it John Adams, and representing the unpopular people in society. Right. But it's funny how everything from, the Pentagon Papers to WikiLeaks to Jonathan Pollard to, Donald Trump, all the way to defending, Jewish, ostensibly neo-Nazis, but actually ethnically Jewish, ostensible neo-Nazis such as Frank Collin marching through Skokie, Illinois in the late 70s. How everything Dershowitz seems to touch ultimately seems to be ultimately to the benefit of some very vested political and geopolitical agendas.
Yeah, and so people might want to go back to our show that we did about something about the double bind in relationship to the First Amendment in terms of speech and press, and we dissected and tried to do a difficult analysis of Assange and Alex Jones in relationship to things like prosecution, deplatforming, and all of that, and we tried to analyze it from a place of where we're sort of being led into a double bind kind of situation, which comes out of these intelligence-based social dynamics, CIA sociology, and like Gregory Bateson, I think, is the basis of that. So people might want to go back and listen to that for some kind of analytical framework for how to think about because these are difficult things to think through in a way that's actually where you're not just, either supporting, the suppression of speech by just saying, these are all from Assange to Ellsberg, these are all fakers, lock them up, they're Russian tools, you could go there with it, but I don't think that's, productive. I don't think that's, complex enough to be accurate, especially in relationship to being an actual American patriots, which at its root would have to do with protecting i.e. the very First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, right? The Bill of Rights. There's a lot on the table around that in terms of, for me personally, in terms of the work that my wife and I did around making a pro se appeal about this and, trying to debate against the previous court and the Attorney General in Missouri and this fusion center located then Kansas City police detective who'd been funded by the local Jewish Federation in Kansas City to go on a paid trip that he perceived as very similar to the congressional junkets to Israel, where his apparent Christian Zionism was sort of lit up like a Christmas tree, and all that he could even say or remember in relationship to what he learned about terrorism, which, by the way, he perceived the trip that he took as somehow like a pat on the back for the work that he had done to fight terrorism as he saw it, but that all he learned about fighting terrorism from the Israelis is that we're all in it together, meaning no one can say boo or question the motives or anything like that. You just have to sort of get in line, and that the terrorists on the other side of the fence, and that's, you know, that they're coming from the other side of the fence. So I'm very sensitive to protecting and defending the principle of free speech and free press against national security apparatus, governments, and things like that. And at the same time, you know, calling out frauds and not letting ourselves get trapped into sort of purposefully weaponized dialectics where we're sort of either we're, you know, doomed if we do, we're doomed if we don't in relationship to the choices that we're alleged to only have.
Yes, and apparently what you said there about the enemy, knowing the enemy, we're all in this together. I guess now, unfortunately, that applies domestically, where now we're all good, patriotic, conservative, God-fearing Americans are all supposed to be in on it together and not blinking an eye and allowing Donald Trump and Bill Barr to send unidentified, unmarked federal cars and agents into American cities to apprehend people. And it's all justified because, well, Donald Trump's worried that the agents and their families might be targeted and doxxed if they were to identify themselves. So that makes, you know, makes illegal criminal unaccounted for arrests and detentions okay now, because it's a threat of you know, they're terrorists anyway, and they're going to hurt the people who are carrying these out. So
in unmarked federal soccer mom minivans, apparently. But and also Alex Jones running commercials about, you remember, it was ISIS hunters,
just hunting permits.
Yeah, just a year ago it was all, you know, sort of like ISIS hunters, right? He said ISIS hunting permit because they were crossing the Rio Grande, just like you know, whatever his name from Project Veritas with the
James O'Keefe.
With his Osama bin Laden mask, you know, sort of justifying the ISIS hunters in the very middle of the United States, as if, like, you know, Sharia law was coming imminently at the you know, under the point of an Islamic sword against your white suburban wives, basically, right? And
we love our Somalis. We love our Muslims. Oh, they're so good. Oh, they're so sweet.
Yeah, and Alex has been riffing on that again, and so now it's been updated, as you said, to Antifa.
I made that up. It might be updated. It might as well update it.
No. I'm saying Alex has been riffing back on that very recently. Yeah. And now he has.
We love our commies.
And he has commercials now with, like, you know, the Antifa hunters and sort of saying, you know, the way to identify them is that the females are bigger than the males and they hang out where demon rats are found, and, you know, and directly, dehumanizing, demonizing.
Now there's this, I forget what it is, this liquid cleanser substance that allows you to get the smell of you know, that you can now that you can shield yourself against the smell of bum piss from Democrat-ran cities. So, I mean, we laugh at it, but it's really not funny. It's really very, very sad is what it is. I mean, it's unfortunate that we've come to this level, but Jeremy, we probably shouldn't scoff at the idea of Sharia law, because Tucker Carlson just had on the distinguished Ayaan Hirsi Ali on his program to expose how Joe Biden's campaign platform is actually enabling and empowering Sharia law. So.
Oh boy, yeah.
Okay, so
Joe Biden's not a proud Zionist; he's a Sharia lover.
And he and Kamala Harris are simultaneously at the same time the faces of racist Democratic criminal injustice, and also the most radical ticket in American history. So I don't know which one it is, but I guess if Sean Hannity can tell his audience that and get them to believe both, then I guess it's a successful operation. I want to throw one more quick point in regarding the conversation about the drug, the history of, like, when we're talking about the counterculture there and in Laurel Canyon and the rise of the, you know, American counterculture. And there's two dynamics at play when we think about the counterculture and then the ensuing culture wars that came out of it, is that you have a two-headed, like, I think you might call maybe destructive effect on, like, American society. And one is the the counterculture of the 60s, which had, a lot of people would say we might say would be an ultimately detrimental effect on a lot of the the 60s hippie culture of anti-war activists, the type of people from a left-wing perspective, anti-war perspective, who could have really, really had a major impact in terms of actually creating a lot of change in terms of culturally. And then it very much weakened, I think, with this government ultimately government intelligence operation of aspects of the counterculture such as that went on. And then you have maybe a decade and a half later with an emerging, black African American resistance to aspects of the post-civil rights movement. You have the infusion of the what we talked about with the the crack cocaine being inserted into the American cities, and the, I think, very, very, very strong evidence that points to very obvious federal involvement in actually engineering of that. And then you have the rise of what we know, the gangster rap culture and the the harmful effect I think that's had on a lot of younger African Americans, which of course now has led to Ben Shapiro being the culture warrior against wet ass P words. So thank you Feds, thank you CIA, thank you Rand Corporation for all of that.
I just gotta say, I'm think if there's got to be a culture war to fight, I'm glad I'd much rather be on the side of defending the right of female rappers to talk about their white ass P words than the question of like gangster rap and NWA and all of that. So I think it is an interesting evolution development of that argument, and actually and maybe what we'll do is we'll go back into that very important aspect about culture war and drugs, and and communities of color, especially in relationship to Hollywood depictions, maybe when we do a deep dive into Oliver Stone, which we are still interested in doing because he released a very interesting interview with Joe Rogan that seems like it would still be worth going over and assessing for historical analysis.
Oliver Stone just did an interview, I believe it may have already been released, or it's about to be, with Anya Parampil for the Gray Zone Project, which I imagine is going to go through his career, and there might be a lot of interesting information contained in that interview from a more like Russian-centric leftist horseshoe perspective. So,
very interesting. All right, so I guess we should get into this document a little bit. I still got to read a lot more. It's almost 1,000 pages, but I just want to say that even if I said before, and I didn't finish the thought, but even if you didn't like really read through the Mueller report, this would actually be if there were one piece of reading that you wanted to do to understand some aspect of the factual dynamics of Trump-Russia, then this would be it. And there's actually, I bet there's a lot of interesting stuff that at the very least, further clarifies certain things that we, only knew about a little bit. Okay. And you can look it up. There's actually a good amount about some of the Israeli dynamics that were, virtually not there with the Mueller investigation. There was little bits, right? We sort of touched on aspects of it, but you go open the document and search for the word Israel, and like one of the first things that popped up for me, and I didn't know this, I don't know if this was public before, but it said that the Guccifer 2 operation, they claim it was being handled, it looks like, by numerous elements, probably out of Russian military intelligence, but that it was done under an Israeli phone number at first, registered from France. So those are sort of interesting facts of this dynamic and of this matter.
Real quick, if I can comment on that aspect, that dynamic of things, combined with, who was at the center of all the Guccifer 2.0 intrigue, it was our friend, Roger Stone, of course. Roger Stone, and it came out, of course, we talked about in these redacted FBI documents from a few months back, that Roger Stone had been in contact with a, quote, senior Israeli official, end quote, about the need to get involved or else Donald Trump is going to lose. And so that brings up a number of interesting questions. And of course, me, when I was, really, really zeroing in and looking closely at, Lee Stranahan, the former Breitbart employee turned Sputnik radio host, now doing, I guess, his own thing, his own, I guess, grift with Pete Santilli or whoever he's affiliated with now, going on InfoWars and cozying up with Steve Pachenik. Lee Stranahan, through Breitbart, is bragged about getting Roger Stone in contact with Guccifer 2.0, and the article that was published on Breitbart that was ghostwritten by Lee Stranahan by Roger Stone regarding, Russia and WikiLeaks and the 2016 election, was within, I believe, within a 7-day time span of this report, of these contacts of Roger Stone with the senior Israeli officials quoted in these redacted FBI documents. So that brings up a number of questions regarding, this Roger Stone, Lee Stranahan dynamic, who knows what with Guccifer 2.0, where the origins are, what it actually represents, and also, Steve Bannon being the head of Breitbart, about to become the head of the Trump campaign, on behalf of Breitbart, giving the green light for this article to be published. And I don't know what it all means. Perhaps they maybe thought it could just be good for whatever operation was going on against the Clinton campaign. But I mean, there's a number of questions there with that really need to still be sorted out and answered. And that's just one part of a much, much deeper, a lot of things that need to be answered regarding this chain of events, all the way from the first DNC, I think, hacking, leaking, all the way to the twin pillars of the October surprise of what became the Pizzagate narrative that is that all the Q people are very excited about, and the just the making it really blatantly clear and obvious, like the depths of the corruption of the Clinton Podesta operation. So,
yeah, and talking about these networks, especially in terms of these information operations that are, involve some kind of conjunction between Russian networks, Israeli networks, and then fed into American networks. It reminds me of one other little aspect I wanted to bring up about some of the kind of characters that we were discussing right before, such as Kissinger, Dershowitz, Ellsberg, Assange, that one commonality that I have noticed is this very strange relationship with September 11th, as a thing unto itself, and a very obvious antagonism to what could be called the truth about September 11th, or 9/11 truth, or something like that. Very obvious with Assange, right? And that was sort of like one of the big quotes of Assange, and is what about 9/11? He's like, well, why do we have to deal with we deal with so many real conspiracies that we've proven, and then that, at the very least, it just becomes a big, controversial, divisive deal where he's sort of seen to be bad-mouthing this whole other aspect of open source investigation. Then, of course, Kissinger, who is going to be the head of the 9/11 Commission, right? And point back to the leadership of the Center for the National Interests, right? Kissinger and Maurice AIG Hank Greenberg, of a singular sort of corporate element at the geographical epicenter of September 11th. Remember, Kroll is an subsidiary of AIG, I believe, by the time September 11th rolls around. You also have Marshall McClellan, right, which is also an additional subsidiary of AIG, headed by Greenberg. But the Marshall McClellan is also, I believe, headed by his son, I think, right? And then who else, of course, is Marshall McClellan is the Kissinger and associate Paul Bremer, who also doesn't show up for work on September 11th.
And goes on television to conveniently blame Osama bin Laden, much like Ehud Barak did over on the other side of the pond for the BBC.
True that. And then so finally on that, I had a very personal, very strange experience with Ellsberg, and it was actually fairly close to the Rand Corporation, because it was a showing for the just released or about to be released documentary about him. I think it was actually called The Most Dangerous Man in the World, about his Pentagon Papers and whistleblowing and all of that. And there was a sort of a function afterwards, and there was a circle of people, and Ellsberg was holding court, and then someone would comment, and then so at this moment, and by the way, I think I've told this story before, but like people like leadership of Code Pink, like Jody Evans was there, and she disclosed to me that of course she's like an old what do they call it? A dancing girl from Vegas, I think is the way she said it to me. She's like, I know a demolition when I see it. And, World Trade Center 7, obviously it's a demolition. But in my work with, kids in the inner cities, I found that it's not good to accuse people of things. So she was equating her work with like African American youths in the inner city in Los Angeles with like the 9/11 perpetrators, some of them in the Bush administration. administration is what it sounded like to me. But it also, disclosed her apparent public duplicity in relationship to that. But at that same time, when the holding court of Ellsberg, and we were all talking about like whistleblowing in the age of the War on Terror, and the sort of the resonance of Ellsberg's whistleblowing, disclosing acts from the last century to this century. And then so I just pointed out that, in the day and age of where anyone who has a few seconds can see World Trade Center being pulverized into smithereens on live television, has become an open source whistleblower of the highest levels of war crimes, mass murder, and treason that you could imagine. So I was like, so in this day and age, I guess we're all whistleblowers. And what happened was, right when I brought up September 11th, I don't remember, I think someone had been like whispering to Ellsberg or something like that. But at that very moment, Ellsberg, the only person in the entire circle, makes his way out of the circle and removes himself far away from it. And so who knows, maybe it wasn't related, but I got the visceral and spiritual sense that it was related. And so now learning some of this deeper dynamics potentially.
Jeremy, remind me, who was it that was tapped to head the 9/11 Commission before public outrage caused him to not be the head?
Kissinger. Kissinger.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, going back to what we were talking about earlier. So if you think maybe there was a connection, I don't know if there is, but I mean, there's clearly, as we've obviously seen, a very vested interest in not getting anywhere near the truth of September 11th from the Kissinger gang. So,
well, yeah, that's what I sort of was originally talking about, was that by by talking about the Center for National Interest, that Kissinger was originally tapped to, investigate 9/11, and he's also at the head of the Center for the National Interest with the other major 9/11 player there, Greenberg. And so I think that's a nest of some sort, and it's indicative also of this closeness to September 11th of these very questionable players like Henry Kissinger. I don't know if I think that's an understatement of the new American century.
Exactly. But going back to that, and we talked about this in our From 9/11 to 11/9 series, and we've talked about it ever since, but when people just want to simply focus on, Israel, this idea, Israel did 9/11, meanwhile, there's this whole other apparatus and element of play. Much of it does interconnect to Israel, and a lot of it does not, but there is a lot of interconnecting with Israel, and obviously pretty much all of this interconnects with the bigger War on Terror operation. But, those who just want to focus on Israel, whether it's September 11th, whether it's, control of the U.S. Government, U.S. politics in a detrimental way in terms of, foreign policy, and particularly policy in the, Middle Eastern region of the world, to the 2016 Trump operation and collusion, like the kind of people who, will be willing to say, if there was collusion, it was clearly the Israelis, but ultimately will either consciously or subconsciously close their minds to the idea of a serious Russian involvement. I mean, you really, when you do start to understand things like the Center for the National Interest and what you said, the key roles of the Kissingers and of the Greenbergs and of their milieu and what that represents, or Dmitry Simas, we talked about him over on previous programs, Richard Burt, people like that, you can't ignore it anymore.
No.
That there is more than just, it's not just Israel as we know it to be, whether it's control of American foreign policy in a detrimental direction, whether it's an operation, in the key event of that whole, of the modern age of that, which would be September 11th, whether it's, control of our domestic and foreign policy, or whether it is presidential politics as it relates to, collusion and propaganda operations taking place domestically here to ensure that certain mobbed up reality show hosts become president.
I guess the way that I would put it is that understanding the Israeli component is necessary but not sufficient. And earlier on, when we were sort of texting notes about some of this, I wrote down that there's these sort of main pillars that to consider in relationship to the Cold War that's still not quite been understood. And one was that Israel and the Middle East were the epicenter of both the negotiation surrounding the Cold War, but also the compromise and the back doors surrounding the Cold War. So obviously, someone like Angleton being sort of most obvious about that, but also someone like Kim Philby, who was Angleton's closest guy in many ways, apparently, and that the Philby as the most infamous Soviet spy of the Western world, and many people said he was so astute and promising as a spy chief that a lot of people believed that he was going to end up at the head of MI6 or something like that eventually. But that before that he was already a Zionist agent, and that there's some evidence in place that he was there and crucial to the intelligence operations surrounding the King David Hotel bombings, driven by, the progenitors of the modern Israeli state and leadership, the Irgun, the Sterngangers, and all that all of those sort of, early proto-Israeli terrorist groups. But Philby, seen as just the Soviet spy, was also a proto-Israeli spy too, and he was right in place, sort of in the role of counterintelligence in the area, when in order to point British intelligence away at the right moment for the King David Hotel bomb to go down. That's what some of the facts seem to suggest about Philby's role in that, and that is such a level, of treason of some level in terms of that, and also that the multiple aspects of that, in terms of the where someone like that was willing to go in terms of the that scale of treason, and that it was not just in terms of simply the Soviets. He was also helped set up the state of terror, as Thomas Suarez's book about Israel titles it. So there's that element, and that's one sort of key component. So in that case, it's very important to understand the Israeli dynamics, both of the last century and this.
And I'll throw in one more thing with Philby and that long-term history of Philby, Cambridge 5, Victor Rothschild, what that represents. I think from a long-term perspective is very important to a full-scale understanding of the what became the Maxwell Epstein operation, that being Robert Maxwell, who has been described as a triple agent basically of the of Israel's Mossad. Of course, he was Mossad super spy, also the MI6, the UK, and also the KGB. So this type of perspective, it's very interesting, especially when you see like the British, as it relates on one hand to the British royal aspect of the Maxwell Epstein operation, but also in terms of, I think, a bigger overall perspective and understanding of the Epstein Maxwell operation. It's something I think you and I want to expand our horizons on, but also be good for people, I think, in general too, would be to get a long-term understanding of these dynamics you were just laying out with the likes of Kim Philby and the long-term operations in the United Kingdom. So.
Yes, definitely. And I'm going to do some more reading on the Victor Rothschild's book too, because he apparently seems to be, if there's a singular even global Zionist agent, and that book is largely about Victor Rothschild's role as the undiscovered Soviet agent of the Cambridge Ring, in many ways also sort of seen similarly as the relationship of Pollard to the Mr. X, sort of Rand Corporation centric committee of that apparently ongoing spy ring, right? The Ledines and all of that the Cambridge Five, even up to someone like Philby, was potentially, they were seen as the Pollards to protect someone, maybe someone's, because I would say at this point it's probably someone like Victor Rothschild's, and then also high-level potential asset, I don't know, agent or asset or what the deal was, but some kind of compromised element in James Angleton and his manufactured wilderness of mirrors, apparently, while he was also sitting at the head of the Israel desk. So I think that you begin to see if you begin to understand these patterns, you can then begin to pick pick them up, that include things like limited hangouts of where you sort of give up someone lower level in order to protect someone higher in place, or the purposeful exposures of certain kinds of deep state operations, right? This sort of classic false flag, but false flag as a sort of an exposure of someone, like where you're actually exposing what they're actually doing. So it's not like you fully it's not like that it's totally false flag, but that you've actually sort of led someone into it to expose them. And I actually think that this explains a lot of the U.S.-Israeli covert relationship in a very heavy fashion over the last, especially the last, since the around the middle of the Cold War, where there is a hand in hand, and there's definitely high-level U.S. elements that are not, primarily of Zionist interests or influence, who are involved in such things as assassinations of like the American president and his brother, and but there's also very much this Israeli state element at the very likely the highest levels of the actual positions of power in the government, tied together by this transnational, the deep state, the mob aspect, the Meyer-Lansky network, most obviously. But in the midst of that, it's not just a holding of hands or a conjunction of some sort, nor is it sort of like a hand-in-glove kind of situation. The way I see it is it's basically a compromise, but it's not a mutual compromise in the way, other than that, yeah, they're both in it together at some level. But as you can see, and maybe this will be complicated a little bit I brought this up, by Pachenik's apparent involvement as a sort of high level U.S., intelligence State Department operator and potentially helping set up the Rabin assassination in Israel. But in general, and definitely in large part, it's mainly a one arrow direction here in terms of the level of the staging of these domestically criminal events, such as the assassinations of presidents or the staging of domestic terrorism. And so I guess what I'm saying is that if elements of the U.S. and Israel are in some kind of partnership in relationship to these events, the criminal leverage mainly goes in the direction from Israel to the U.S. And I believe there's a lot of, it accretes over time. It substantially accumulates in terms of what you might call geopolitical blackmail, or even like intergenerational, interstitial blackmail, state-to-state blackmail, where the sort of state apparatus in Israel has this long known and documented history of having been involved and often upping the ante too, including the obvious example of Stuxnet in terms of, cyber weapons and all of that. But even things such as September 11th and the Kennedy assassination have those dynamics where it's very possible that the Israeli elements sort of up the ante on it at some level. And then once the American element is implicated in that, then there is an unfolding and a gathering of the weight of the actual criminal leverage against the American side by the Israeli side that I believe explains a lot of what we see, that something like, the Epstein network is just an emanation of something that's has a lot more weight and historical materiality behind it that everybody involved knows. So I think that's something to consider, and I think that also helps out in terms of the analysis of the issue of, getting beyond the simplistic of it. Is Israel the outpost of the American empire, like the sort of Chomsky-esque style, or is Israel, is it full Zog, and is Israel controlling the United States down to the last fold,
That's very, very interesting that you make that comparison, because, I've always realizing more and more now, ultimately, it seems like what that does is it's the dual hand of like of the respective, anti, in a lot of ways you might call anti-establishment. Kind of much of what we know is alt media of anti-war activism on one hand, especially on the left, centers around this idea of Israel being, U.S. is the tail that wags the dog that is Israel. Israel's U.S. is fascistic, imperialistic, bully boy, right? As far as like the racist, capitalist, global U.S. imperialist empire. But then you've got the other dynamic on the far right, mainly that, and there's some left overlap, obviously, in some areas. That Israel is Israel's the tail wagging the U.S. dog, and that Israel dominates and controls the U.S. And honestly, there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, especially when you look at domestic politics with the power that, say, the Israel lobby through AIPAC has. I mean, you cannot ignore that 2,000-pound elephant in the room when it comes to a serious conversation about like the pro-Israelifying of American politics and politicians. But still, I think both those arguments are ultimately flawed in a lot of ways. But what it does, it seems that both of those do and it's interesting, we keep talking about this horseshoe of like where these diametrically polar opposite left and right interests come together, like in this almost seems like this Russian-centric narrative of like world events, where both of these narratives ultimately do, it seems, either shift away from looking at a serious Russian and or Chinese role in these global affairs, and also it leaves that out, and also centers things to where it's just strictly, whether it's from this U.S. dominates Israel or the opposite perspective, that it's it's the U.S. And Israel that are basically complicit in all of this, and that you either leave out any type of serious inquiry about I would say the third very important hand in this, Russia, and then also from to a different level that we still haven't quite really gotten a complete grip on is a Chinese role. So I thought you pointed that out, and I think that's a very interesting parallel.
Yeah, and all of this also then the piece of this too is that this does involve the most criminal bad elements domestically, maybe the political indigenous aspect of the United States. That's what we continue to see over and over again too, that are directly tied up with these other international or foreign elements. And the other point that you pointed onto there was that I believe is the second piece that needs to be dealt with in really, unpacking the 20th century and the remnants of the Cold War in a way so that we can understand what is actually going on right now, is not only that Israel is this fixed point of reference, it's the lever, or it's the lever, between the East and the West, obviously now sort of, so whereas for the last century it was seen as like this the leverage point, now it's become the center of the world, or the end of things like the Belt Road Initiative and the 21st century questions that we're now needing to deal with in terms of the next generation of technology and cyber weapons and all of that. And so this other element that does need to be understood from the 20th century in terms of the Cold War is a piece that was, also again easily, covered up between what was seen as the extremism of the John Birchers to, obviously Roy Cohn in the fold in the middle between the John Birchers and McCarthyism, versus the sort of liberal set who would accuse you of being a tinfoil hatted John Bircher of some sort for talking about these facts that call into question Kissinger's counterintelligence background, potentially as a long-term Soviet agent. So that's the other element there, is that there is this high-level Soviet penetration that looks like it was kept in place to large part, especially in the United States, most specifically, and then covered up to this day, including the possibility of these hawk-dove and then left-right sort of fake theatrical horseshoe dynamics in the mix there. And so I just wanted to put that down as a proposal for understanding as we move forward here.
Yes, and as you look at I think 2016, which is at the center of so much of our obviously political intrigue and conversation in a very limited way, because the media, our institutions, the media and government have not done their duties in actually accurately, I believe, informing the American public and for that matter, the global public of what have really, very strongly appears to have taken place in the, 2016 election, as we've talked about so many times, the 11-9 operation, as we've called it. But this is so key to this. I think this is at the center of it, is that ultimately, I think to understand 2016, much like the Maxwell operation, we have to understand, I think, really try to gain an understanding of this long-term nature of the types of things we've been talking about just now with these very, I would say, Israeli, Soviet nests of intrigue that have been operating both in the shadows and right out in the open for many decades now. So I think it's right at the center of this. I think, Jeremy, we should start to wrap up. Do you want to any final thoughts on this? Then I have a couple of quick topics introduced before we close out, maybe by circling back to the 2020 election.
Okay, and maybe we could do a deeper dive on 2020 over the weekend, maybe.
Okay.
But I'm open to touching on some stuff. But yeah, let me just read one page of this report just to give folks a sense of what's in there. For example, they actually touch on the question of the Alpha Bank server. And there's some aspect of detail in there that some of it's a little bit technical. I didn't concentrate on it long enough to really get to what they're actually saying. But it seems to me that it leaves the whole thing hanging again. It says that there's some explanations that we've already heard from the sort of Trump CTO type or IT guy, and then this external email contractor who was seen in the middle of it. But then when you see it, there's these two paragraphs blacked out where they say, we see no reason to disagree with that. And that's it. So we don't know what actually what has been determined to likely be the truth of the Alpha Bank Trump Tower servers. I still think there's something potentially very interesting there that still needs to be explained, that goes way beyond just the sort of sharing emails, but is very likely about data sets, and actually this question of data warfare and the question of databases and stuff like that, I think is going to become more and more important in terms of actually understanding it, and that it's very likely that they were coordinating data sets or something like that in what we had, hypothesized might involve something like health data coming out of the DeVos families, Spectrum Health, I think it was called.
That's made more interesting by the depths of Eric Prince's, multi-pronged operations that, have Russian, very significant, I'd say, Russian involvement, in terms of the types of global operations Eric Prince was doing in relation to 2016 and its aftermath. So that makes the question of Alpha Bank and the DeVos servers, even, another layer dynamic that I don't know if we had a full grasp on that, 2.5-3 years ago when we covered this stuff for the first time, so.
Yeah. Okay, so let me get into one page about specifically about Cambridge Analytica and SCL, page 667, where it says, quote, Bannon described his own role with Cambridge Analytica as that of a, quote, typical investment banker, unquote, conducting due diligence on behalf of principal investor Robert Mercer and taking a board position from which capitalization decisions could be overseen. Bannon later introduced the Trump campaign to Cambridge Analytica as a potential client. Right, and now, so with we won't deal with this now, but with the Shadowgate film and InfoWars, Millie Weaver, flare up and all of that I'm sure that can be seen as, see, we told you this was, all these deep state swampers trying to basically push data warfare on Trump. And he was sort of, he had just animal magnetism that could have fully won this thing for him, and he didn't even want or need.
Even though they ultimately took over his campaign, but I digress. But still,
right. So which one was it? Was it during Bannon or during Manafort where the problem went down, or was that exactly the henchman that Trump decided to go with? Right. Okay. Right. Yeah, Trump's not a non-manager type. That's not how he was able to basically, make billions over the course of his career with very little actual serious business acumen, tons of bankruptcies, and this background of apparently looked like, just eventually finding a nice velvet rut in setting up transnational money laundering operations suspended between golf courses and hotels with a strong flow coming out of Russia. And so, there's that too. All right. So back to this document. Quote, international operations of Cambridge Analytica and SCL. Both SCL and Cambridge Analytica personnel were engaged in election-related work around the globe. Kaiser indicated, I believe that's Brittany Kaiser. Kaiser indicated that at the time of her employment by Cambridge Analytica, SCL Group was running, quote, between 8 to 10 national elections every year for prime minister and president all around the world, unquote. According to Kaiser, she offered Cambridge Analytica services to prospective clients in approximately 30 different countries and worked on, quote, 7 to 8 national projects, unquote, during her tenure across, quote, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, unquote. Okay. Then down below there's a footnote. Okay, I'm going to skip the footnotes for now. Moving on. Quote, Cambridge Analytica and SCL engaged in a variety of efforts to influence the outcomes of elections abroad. According to Wiley, that's Christopher Wiley, he was hired by SCL Group to be director of research based in part on his previous experience working on political campaigns and developing micro-targeting strategies. Wiley alleged that Cambridge Analytica engaged in the, quote, procuring of hacked material for the benefit of its clients, unquote, the use of, quote, specialized technologies and intel gathering services from former members of Israeli and Russian state security services, unquote, and the management of information operations on behalf of pro-Russian parties in Eastern Europe and the Baltics. So I don't know what the Aaron Mates do with this stuff. Do they basically say this is not true, or does it not matter?
Or do they just go down, the more likely they try to sell their audiences, oh, well, Steve Bannon's just, this is all just U.S. centric. But I mean, really, but that's why it's important to actually peel away the layers. And you see, well, yeah, it very largely is U.S. centric, but, that's not the beginning or the end of it. But I mean, I could see that possibly being the way to do it, because, I mean, I think, honestly, it's harder and harder intellectually, honestly, just try to dismiss and poo-poo all this. But I know a lot of people are going to continue to try their hardest to do so, but I don't know how you do that at this point.
Okay, moving on here. Quote, Kaiser stated that Cambridge Analytica had an office based in Skopje, Macedonia. Remember the Macedonia farms, the troll farms, from which political projects targeted at Macedonia, as well as other regional projects, were run. Kaiser described some of Cambridge Analytica's work in Eastern Europe prior to her joining the company, including a program that sought to test the effectiveness of Russian propaganda, ostensibly in order to develop counter-propaganda strategies. Okay, that's very interesting. And actually, at the end of this report, it delves back into the Steele dossier, and it makes some interesting, it makes some interesting analysis about how the intelligence was assessed in terms of that raw intelligence document, and how Steele himself thought about how likely things were to be true. And so people of all takes on the matter should go read that to sort of get a sense of it. And I just saw one thing that's interesting is that around things like such as Michael Cohen was they said he was in Prague, right? That was the big claim. That was seen to be a really big claim. And then it was apparently knocked down, and then it was apparently picked back up, or the phone was caught in Europe or something like that. But then it quotes, I think, Steele himself, or maybe it's what's his name, the journalist who
Glenn Simpson?
Glenn Simpson, thank you. Maybe Glenn Simpson quoting Steele. But basically, Steele said he's almost positive from the variety of his sources that Cohen was in Europe in that framework. And then he mentioned specifically maybe it was what's it called? Budapest, like i.e. the Budapest Bridge, i.e. is where, we hypothesized that if there were an operational epicenter of the 11/9 operation, especially in a European context, it was very likely Budapest. And people like I keep remembering, now I've forgotten all these guys' names now. There was a guy who'd been to Budapest 6 times or something like that during the election. I forget his name. It's all right. We'll figure out how much of this we need to relearn. But I think that's an interesting thing that it wasn't for sure that it was Cohen in Prague necessarily. Remember what I've always stressed about the Steele document. It's raw intelligence. So it's very likely that it is not, as the Lindsey Grahams, the Queen G's try to tell you, that it's just it's a pithy document. You know, it's worth not the piss that it was peed on with, and it wasn't Donald Trump's piss. You know, it's not that at all. It is, there's very likely that the general architecture of it is very likely closer to the truth of the situation than not, while there being questions about the specific facts and some stuff maybe being completely wrong, other stuff being completely right. But I think people got to go look back at the question of the Budapest Bridge and go look at that series of articles, which are very, very interesting, which of course, remind us of the centrality of the Arthur Finkelstein network in the middle of all of this, and specifically in the middle of the mainlining of the Trump operation as it began getting off the ground and sort of pumping it into the heart of the RNC. And then, of course, his buddy his mentee, John McLaughlin, one of Finke's kids, coming directly out of working closely with Netanyahu in Israel to working as a quote-unquote pollster for the Trump campaign, or as you pointed out, Greg, the other Finke kid, Tony Fabrizio, being the one identified as the one helping Manafort supply Kalimnik, whether it's as Aaron Mate said, he's just an alleged Russian intelligence officer, or he's a State Department asset, or whether he's, as the Senate Intelligence Report says, he is a Russian intelligence officer, Kalimnik, the polling data directly out of the heart of the Trump administration, and there's Finke's kids once again at the epicenter.
Everything
of all
down
that.
to, I believe this was deep data that had projections on everything all the way down to individual precincts. So.
Which is exactly, what is shown to have been done by the data analytics, by the Bannons and the Posobiaks and the Cambridge Analytica. And it is that scene in Christopher Wiley's book about Cambridge Analytica where they begin sort of introducing the technology that they've helped create to Alexander Nix, the CEO, as Bannon comes and visits them, and showing them that they can call a housewife in Tennessee with all these data points, and then they start matching it up with beyond Facebook. When Facebook was crucial because it added the psychosocial, the psychopolitical dynamics of it, of data into the fold of what all the political campaigns already had at some level, which was, all of the credit score reports and all the address associated information. But it was this sort of social psychology related, politically influential information that was really key in something like the potential novelty of the Cambridge Analytica operation. And just reminder that this idea of psychometrics and psychographics, and we've always talked about psychological warfare. And there's like a brief video on my YouTube channel where I recorded where we had an interview on Tim Kelly's program years ago. And I was breaking down this understanding of the rhetorical forms and rhetorical arts from the Greek tradition in terms of logos, pathos, and ethos, and then reminding people that there's an additional element of this called kairos, which is actually another element of time, versus chronos, which is linear time. Kairos is seen as more improvisational or in the moment, or as the rhetorical art of pushing through, identifying and opening and pushing through, or something like that. But what we're seeing now in terms of these data warfare operations is, we've always had psychological warfare, right? Whatever it was, propaganda. But that idea that it's sort of tied to the written word to some extent, that it's tied to the logic at some level. But then on top of that, now we're dealing with things like psychographics, which I associated with ethos, really, which is meaning like the idea of the understanding the ethics and or culture of your group, right? And so in like Facebook, the whole thing is seen as a social graph, and so then you have your own social graph, such as your friends, the people who you accept information from, see information from, can pass information to. So that's psychographics at some level, and I believe that's related to ethos. The understanding of the ethos as a rhetorical art element. And then so you can see how that can be turned into warfare. So psychographical warfare, where you're basically your social circle, your social network circle is turned into a weapon against you, where it's identified very likely who you can receive certain information from, and then so basically it's used to probably even pressure you into taking things on, or to overwhelm you by receiving it from so many different sources or something like that. So there's a lot there to be unpacked. But then psychometrical warfare, or psychometrics, which is what Kogan, this Russian data scientist, is said to have been doing in relationship to accessing dozens of millions of Americans' Facebook data and then passing it to SCL and Cambridge Analytica and the Bannon Trump operation, was that he was doing psychometrics basically based on sort of silly seeming artificial, superficial kind of analyses, like opt-in tests, or things on Facebook where you find out what kind of type of da-da-da you are, or that kind of stuff. People were offering up data points that was both
ineffective troll operations. They want to try to say influenced an election, but meanwhile they take out like the very deep aspects of these operations, try to make it into something simplistic, like, oh my gosh, a couple of Russian trolls set up stupid surveys on Facebook.
Right, that's actually a great point, because this was something with the Mueller investigation, right? The focus on the IRA, even though there's something very significant there, especially in terms of the so-called Max Blumenthal defined hot dog man, i.e. the Eric Prince of Russia, of the Eric Prince of the Russian deep state, right? Who's basically not only a celebrity chef, but he's also running these obvious sort of Russian intelligence cutout data troll operations. But he's also the head of the Wagner Group, the major Russian military contractor, now being heavily involved in Africa, alongside the U.S. and Israeli and obviously Chinese elements.
Imagine if Gordon Ramsay was both a close personal friend of Hillary Clinton's and just happened to have major military contracts here in the U.S. I don't think he'd be an innocent hot dog vendor.
That's a great point, right? Like if Eric Prince were also Gordon Ramsay. It's like, so there's sort of an element between Gordon Ramsay and Eric Prince, all in one figure, and then it's being described by supposedly a major left dissident in the United States as a hot dog salesman. Okay, there's a disingenuousness there, but it is the case that the focus on the IRA and the sort of troll farm operation distracted or undermine the centrality of these mass, what I would call con-ops, consciousness operations that were highly refined, and highly specific, way beyond just sort of setting up these sort of fake Facebook groups and sending them to different sides of the street to protest against each other, like is said to be done by the IRA troll farm. But no, this kind of stuff, this really highly refined stuff that also is, obviously it's not just Russian, but there's this Russian element there too. Whether it's the, Kogan, the background of Kogan, the guy who ultimately supplies the psychometrics that gets the whole thing running. And he used that actually not only to access the actual psychometrics, meaning the tests that people were taking and him running that in, but he mainly used it as a backdoor to everybody's social graphs who signed up for it, that it allowed him to then access all of the data from the friends of your friends, or that kind of thing. But then even the background of the people who were invested into the SCL group and all of that still seems a little convoluted in my mind. But you got to look into Firtash. There's some background that Firtash might have been in the mix there in terms of SCL. And then people like Vincent Chenguis, who was obviously in the mix there. And so I think that then combination obviously puts it into this, the 11-9 operation as we see it, as someone like Seth Abramson really, really well describes in a transnational fashion, with a very strong U.S. domestic element, a very strong Russian element, and a very strong Middle Eastern element, mainly focused around the commanding heights of the Israeli government, but also at the commanding heights of the UAE and Saudi and Egypt too.
Yes, and I would also throw in for another mention as well, another person, in addition to Seth Abramson, who I think's really made a lot of strides. I don't know if he doesn't quite have an Abramson level of understanding as far as like the global natures, but I think he's really made a lot of strides, particularly when it comes to Israel, is Eric Garland, the game theory analyst. You can catch him on Narrative Live with Zev Shalev on a semi-regular basis, and I recommend the Narrative live streams, even though there's some issues with in terms of maybe some of the people there having a little too much faith, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly being maybe dishonest agents in terms of the relative amounts of faith that they have in like maybe a Biden-Harris presidential campaign that it's unwarranted. I recommend a lot of the work and research and that's being put out by the Narrative crew, and particularly Garland, who I think's made a lot of strides in a similar manner as Seth Abramson's made over the last few years. So I wanted to throw that in there. And to wrap up on this topic, because I do think we are going to save the maybe a deeper election talk for a show maybe later this weekend or in the next week. I wanted to bring up two topics that happened in the last week that I think are both very important. And you made me think about both of them.
One thing first, though, just in terms of sources, like that, as you're listening to those sources that you were talking about, which are really good, I think, then throw in the mix the John Swinn's website, exposetheenemy.com, to see the deep research that's been going on for years now. That shows you a lot of the background that people like Garland are just getting to now. But I also appreciate the perspective of like the Seth Abramsons and the Eric Garlands in terms of being able to reach the mainstream perspective. And someone like Abramson, has done the work of what the actual long form journalists who are paid to actually be journalists, unlike Seth Abramson, who should have been doing. And what he's done is he's shown that all of this stuff was open source to a large extent by curating stories from all around the world. And this is actually sort of what John Swinn did at his site too, is he's curated a lot of, maybe even beyond sort of news sources that includes, self-published articles, but also, references to book length material and government reports, along with articles. And then Abramson, for example, has knit all of these thousands of articles from around the world into his full length books that describe the interests and the mechanisms of what actually happened in relationship to the Trump operation very, very well. Okay, I just wanted to add that, Greg.
No, thank you for doing that, and shout out to John wherever you are. I'm hoping to work together in the near future, John. So anyway, and thank you for doing that. John really is a vitally important source of the deep understandings of like the really deep research that maybe the Eric Garlands of the world are starting to slowly but surely to understand. And so thank you for that. And you mentioned when you were going at the end of your when we were talking about the Dr. Kogan and Cambridge Analytica and the IRA group and the depths of like these type of like Russian operations that have simply been dismissed as, hot dog vendors putting out meaningless with trolls who put out meaningless surveys or memes on Facebook. You brought up both of the final topics that two quick topics that I think need to be touched on that happened in the last week. One is the historic quote peace end quote deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which I think is very critical to this this 2016 global operation. I mean, it's right at the center of it. And then also you mentioned the name Vincent Chenguiz. It made me think of the announcement of the indictment of the American-born, IDF-trained former chief of staff to Benjamin Netanyahu and also former business partner of Eric Prince's, Ari Harrow. So I wanted to bring up those two topics to kind of close out the show tonight.
Thank you. I already forgot about Ari Harrow being indicted, and it looks like he did a proffer deal potentially, so that he had already given up some of the goods, and that he's being indicted on lower charges in relationship to giving up some of the goods of this corruption investigation that has at the epicenter of it Benjamin Netanyahu. And just to remind folks, I think we dealt with this background a little bit first when we were diving into Eric Prince, actually, I think it was in late 2017.
Yes, it would have been at our show, I believe, Jack of all trades, Eric Prince's role in all things. I think we initially called it Israelgate, but then modified the name as we learned more and more as time went on that it's not just Israelgate, but I believe it was Jack of all trades, Eric Prince. I believe that was in the title. We kind of went through an overview of a lot of Eric Prince's nefariousness, and we talked quite a bit about Ari Harrow in that show, which would have been December 2017.
And so the key connector here is someone called Dorian Barak, who has a very interesting background that we go into a little bit in that show, but includes being an international consultant with an emphasis in China and Asia more generally, but also being a lawyer out of the United States at the firm called Skadden Arps, which is at the epicenter of lots of issues going back, including the sort of Kenneth Bialkin, who was the head of the ADL, and all these other organizations, and Bialkin at the epicenter of the Pollard affair, ran to Israel apparently after Pollard was caught. I believe he was the head of the ADL at that time, and so the ADL was involved with the cover-up of the Pollard affair, and this high-level Skadden Arps guy was at the epicenter of that. And so this Dorian Barak, who holds together these investments really in terms of Eric Prince and Ari Harrow, i.e. Benjamin Netanyahu, and then his touching into China, I think is crucial to all of this and something that people might want to go look into. And there's actually two people on Twitter who I believe probably will give you the most background on this, and that would be interesting journalist Robert Young Pelton. And then the other is Greg Smith, I think his name is, right? Greg, he was actually like a C-suite level Greg with Eric Prince.
Yes, Greg with 2 G's, Greg Smith.
And he has the goods on Eric Prince and where all of that went, and he knows a lot of, he's definitely a fact witness of some sort and looks to be seriously gung-ho about exposing Prince. And so those two have really put out a lot of the background of how this Ari Harrow, Dorian Barak, Eric Prince network is going down. And then you mentioned this UAE situation. It was like, you had a sense that this whole, West Bank annexation thing was obviously a political fraud. Well, it's a de facto political fraud because it's already been de facto annexed, right? The ongoing Israeli occupation is the de facto annexation of the West Bank with all the increasing settlements and all of that. And so at some level, I knew that there was something coming, that there was going to be a holding back, he was going to hold up on it. Netanyahu was going to say, we're not going to do that, and something was going to come of it. But I didn't know this was going to be the result of it, an attempt to float a Trump victory in diplomacy as this sort of incredible breakthrough that no one saw coming between the Israelis and the Emiratis in terms of diplomatic relations.
Very interestingly, Jeremy, and unsurprisingly, if you ask me, Joe, I'm a Zionist. The Meshulam Reichless was my biggest campaign donor on a couple of presidential campaigns. Biden praised this move, talking about how wonderful it is that this happened for Israel. So,
and that's a good point. And so did the triumvirate of Bill Maher, can I lick your butt enough to get a job to Benjamin Netanyahu Maher, and then Andrew Yang and Pete AIPAC Buttigieg all agreed on that too. You're right.
Yes. Andrew, economic populist turned CNN hiree. But and so, I mean, we've talked about before, like this dynamic with one of the major things with this Trump operation geopolitically is the remaking of the Middle East in terms of, we talked about like the split in U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Israel, and how, Israel's long been obviously important in terms of the preservation of Israel as a strong state in the region. But now you have this extreme shift where just completely overturning, I think, a long norm this is what I think what fears a lot of people against the Trump presidency in terms of like a foreign policy perspective, is like this overturning of, we talked about this before, this international world order, and this particularly, Israel is a very powerful state in the Middle East. Obviously, there's still a ton of domestic control going on that all politicians basically toe a very strongly pro-Israel line, but still where there's still a reining and a kind of keeping under control of the Israeli state with, and I think part of that has to do with propping up, other countries in the Middle East, kingdoms and other countries with a lot of money and resources that have traditionally been, not so friendly to Israel because of a combination of the Palestinian situation, also their own interest in not seeing this behemoth in Israel just grow out of control. But now, what part of this has done is you had this, obviously the Saudi Arabia operation with the rise to power of Mohammed bin Salman, who completely turned over decades of, official Saudi policy of not recognizing Israel until justice is done for Palestinians. It basically completely overturned that. Is MBS and everything is all but officially basically given a green light for Israel to do whatever it wants and really put that nail in the coffin, so to speak, of like any type of Palestinian hopes and dreams for their own state or justice or whatnot. And there's a similar dynamic that's taken place with MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, in the United Arab Emirates. And it's been less publicized than what's been going on in Saudi Arabia, but I'd say it's a very similar dynamic. And this is another key piece of this operation of basically turning, I think, the Middle East once again for I don't know how many time in the last 100 years, completely on its head and shifting away from like the traditional U.S.-Saudi Arabia alliance or the traditional U.S.-Arab relationships in the region to this diametrically 180 shift, as bad as Israel's already been out of control as the state of Israel's already been, in a completely, I'd say entirely different direction. I think this is a major part of that operation, and also hanging in the back. It's very interesting. The former the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer, on Breitbart Radio, brought up that this is good for war, for keeping America out of future military conflicts. You have this aspect of things as well, where you've even got the Ron Dermers representing Israel playing to this idea of less American foreign intervention, that this is going to be good for the U.S., that Israel's going to have more control. But you also have the lingering specter of what we've called the shift, the multipolar world, and the roles of Russia and China, and who's going to replace the U.S. in the region if that's a major goal of the Trump operation, which I think it is. And ultimately, I think you have to be thinking eastward. So I think this is a very important event. It's a natural, logical follow-up to the types of events that took place in 2016 and taken place since, in this remaking of this critical region of the world once again, and the U.S. is playing a key role in making it happen, while also ultimately, really, you might say, giving up a lot of its power in the region and paving the way for this other power vacuum to come in, while still from within, these forces are, I would say, doing a lot to really undermine our own national security from within. So.
Yeah. And speaking of Dermer, wasn't he actually involved with the Trump campaign or something? I forget what it was.
I don't remember if he was involved specifically, but I do remember back when like a lot of like anti-Zionists were portraying Steve Bannon to be this great hero. I do remember Ron Dermer specifically pointed out that the Netanyahu government specifically excited to work with Steve Bannon among those in the Trump campaign. I don't remember though.
Yeah, I can't remember that. I think maybe there was something having to do with the transition or the inauguration or something.
Possibly, I'm forgetting,
right. But
yeah,
I just, in terms of multipolarism, one interesting thing I noticed in this Kissinger book, and we'll have to go into more on that in terms of Helmut Sonnenfeld is a key figure in this network, and interestingly, similarly to the way that we've reported on the Israeli, mole, it looks like the now president of the Jewish Institute for National Security America, Michael Makovsky, put in, despite the security concerns of the Pentagon, security clearance people, to head up U.S. oil operations post-Iraq war. Who has now been identified as basically likely Israeli intelligence, having worked in Israeli foreign service for many, many years. That kind of, and then of course the obvious of the Trumps and the pushing of the obviously counterintelligence compromise, at very least in terms of emoluments at the very least, but also in terms of obvious counterintelligence issues of obviously Kushner, the most obvious, in terms of pushing him through these security clearances. That something very similar was done by Kissinger. Kissinger was pushing his people against the security clearance interests of in desires of the security clearance people, people like Sonnenfeld, but also people like Morton. What's his name again? Morton Halperin?
Morton Halperin, yes.
Yeah. And so that is very interesting. But in this book, it basically, the Henry Kissinger Soviet agent, it says that, Kissinger made this very, very rapid rise from his coming into, from working counterintelligence in the army, in sort of the end and post World War II European German theater. And then that is supposedly when he is then brought into the Soviet fold, somewhere in there in the 40s, and then is basically a long-term mole of some sort from this Bohr. He's titled Bohr, is his code name supposedly. But then he makes this sort of rapid rise into the commanding heights of the American security establishment out of Harvard, right? Harvard becomes his launching off point. But what's interesting is that Nixon reads some of these papers that he's written, supposedly becomes appealing to Nixon bringing Kissinger on board, and they have to do with the how to best manage multipolar politics in the age of the bilateral Cold War. So very, very interesting of Kissinger. I mean, anyone who looks at his background sees that that's what he did, right? He was a geopolitical manager of all of these relationships, and that we're beginning to look into the actual effect of those things over the long haul, especially in a derogatory fashion beyond Kissinger the peacemaker, or beyond even just Kissinger the warmonger or coup manufacturer, something even beyond that and derogatory going on. But just to finish up a little bit on this on this. I just want to do one little last paragraph in terms of this Senate intelligence report that talks about the Bannon and Cambridge Analytica in a Russian sphere. Is that okay, Greg?
Yes, please do it. This is a follow-up. I believe I believe we might be coming full circle. We were going to talk, I think we actually want to talk about this earlier, but this is a follow-up on what we were talking about with like where the interests of, Breitbart conceived in Israel, the heavily Likud-friendly Zionist faction involved with that, where their interests and goals ultimately intersect and overlap with, very, very important Russian global and geopolitical goals. So go ahead.
Okay, very good. Page 668 of the Volume 5 Senate Intelligence Report. Quote, according to Wiley in spring 2014, Steve Bannon approved proceeding with Cambridge Analytica-sponsored focus groups concerning Vladimir Putin and Russian expansionism, preparatory to the development of a predictive response model. Wiley also indicated that Mr. Bannon and Konstantin Kalimnik, who is just a data analyst, a Ukrainian political operative with established ties to a Russian intelligence service and a protracted working relationship with Paul Manafort, were two of three individuals likely responsible for this idea. Wiley added that of the 200 predictive response models Cambridge Analytica was developing in the United States, Vladimir Putin was the only world leader addressed, and Russian expansionism was the only foreign topic contemplated. And Greg, you pointed out that, that this idea of Russian expansionism, sure, its most frontal interpretation is, of course, geopolitics and Ukraine and Crimea, yes, and all of that, but there's also this element of the mental, potentially the hybrid warfare expansionism, but then, as you pointed out, the European theater, right, Greg?
Yes, things such as and I think even people who see like Russia as a positive force in all this would acknowledge, Russia's there is a Russian role in terms of domestic politics in Europe. They may not look at it as a bad thing, but you'd acknowledge there's a role there. But I mean, Russia's been, I think, very, very, has very much had a vested interest in the rise of, I would say, pseudo-populism in much of Europe, which I think is the culminating event of that, as far as like the last, I think, several years, would be the passage of Brexit, which of course Breitbart, conceived in Israel, is right there at the center of Brexit with Breitbart London. And then you consider all of the Russian aspects to the Cambridge Analytica Mercer operation as well. And then culminating, I would say, on a global perspective, I mean, at least a major aspect of this. I mean, there's been more things going on globally, such as, Bolsonaro coming to power, even somebody like Duterte coming to power. And there have been a number of other European events in Europe that have taken place over the last several years. But, Brexit would be the key, I would say, European event and then Trump, obviously coming to power here in the U.S. And what I've noticed, once again, I go back to the combination of geopolitical interest of Breitbart, conceived in Israel, a very heavy Likud-oriented right-wing agents here, operatives here in the U.S. I'd say somebody like Senator Ted Cruz or Senator Tom Cotton would be representative of these interests, combined with this Russian-centric aspect. And there's a mutual disdain, I would say, shared by Russia and Israel for a lot of the international institutions. And so you're seeing this, such as the European Union, which is seen for varying reasons as perhaps not being the friendliest institution as far as Russia is concerned. And Israel has a disdain even for the slaps on the wrist it receives from EU member countries. And I think there's also a fear of Europe in its current form, as well as the U.S., shifting more culturally to the left, which would mean that a more left-leaning population is more likely to sympathize with victims rather than, say, oppressors in places such as Palestine. And so I think,
Greg, as the woman who asked the question, directly after me to Dennis Ross at May 9th, 2016 at the Kansas City Public Library as we were being unlawfully ejected, and then me and the librarian who helped organize the event and allowed the security to come in the first place were being arrested and then prosecuted for more than a year afterwards. She said, how are we going to deal with the people at the UN and the human rights and that whole agenda? So I think that would be the shorthand for what you're talking about. Yeah.
There you go. But you see, there's a common bond, I think, for, say, Russian-oriented operatives and Israeli-oriented operatives with a mutual disdain for these institutions, what we referred to before in a lot of ways as the post-war, liberal international world order, or whatever you want to call it. And a lot of the never Trump neocons, the Bill Kristols, the Robert Kagans, believe in this to a much, I think, larger, much more than these hardline right-wing Israeli operatives to do as well, which I think is a big part of this neocon split, as we've called it in so many ways. But I think that this brings together Russian and Israeli interests and also U.S. domestic interests that are very closely entwined, particularly in the right wing here of the U.S. The right side of the U.S. deep state, which Alex Jones and his ilk have never exposed, have a very vested interest in, with strong connections to both Israel and Russia. So I think this brings it together. And when you understand this dynamic of not just Israelis, not just Zionist oriented, but it's very Russian oriented as well. What happened with the Cambridge Analytica SCL group and everything that's gone on since, and the role of operatives such as Nigel Farage in the UK, or the money man there, Aaron Banks, and their backgrounds and their connections. So yeah, I think you do have to look at this in that regard, and they're benefiting from all kinds of things. And one of the things that's being benefited from is this shift in terms of the Middle East and what's going on with countries, the shifting of, say, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and these powerful, oil countries, and with all this oil and wealth and number of interests and a lot of political power and influence over the the Arab Muslim world. So I think it all does interconnect in a lot of ways, and so
yeah. Well, that's good. Thank you, Greg, and maybe we can touch up more on specific political pattern moving into 2020 elections, or lack thereof, or whatever.
Well, I can end with the comment. I think you'll concur with this. Once again, people like us, once again, we really don't have a choice once again. And I know a lot of people are going to try to scare you to the lesser evils, such as, well, you have to vote for Biden Harris to stop the tyrant Trump, or you have to vote for Trump to stop the leftist insurrection, whatever you want to call it, although I'd hardly call Joe Biden a leftist insurrection, but you get my drift. But so, I would say also I'd be very, very wary not to fall for, or very adamant not to fall for, like, this lesser evil argument, because I think it gets people every time. And I think this time, unfortunately, for millions of Americans, I think this is going to be no exception. But I think it's important not to be ensnared by that lesser evil argument. And as much as we're really out there as far as the Trump operation really getting front and center to just how terrible and detrimental this whole thing is, we've got to remember, people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not going to provide a needed alternative. So.
No, but at the same time, I also understand that the depths of democracy, the deepest aspect, the most important part of democracy, including elections, is what we know and what we stand for and what we then push for in many ways. And so I am both not for sort of being pushed into lesser evilism, nor am I interested in being pushed into sort of, voting doesn't matter and don't you dare make a decision about the lesser evil or any of that. In the midst of all of that, my sense is that what the most important thing we can do in relationship to the actual democratic process is not necessarily to vote, nor not to vote, but to figure out what the heck is going on and to speak the important truths that people need to know and that we need to also figure out, so that we can then have a politics that is based on the truth foremost. Okay. And so I'm reminded of the Thomas Jefferson letter of 1780 something, of that, that he was very aware at that point that between a functional government and a functional press, that he would have to choose the latter. And I think that's really still the case. But I would say, and as I said this on the No Lies election panel, that hopefully the point of some of what we would do here at the Antedote is that we can turn vigorous citizen truthful analysis, i.e. citizens press, into the potential of a functional politics and a functional government. Okay. And so that's what I would hope, that we begin to figure out how to move there, rather than get caught in the double bind of, the voting, not voting, the lesser, which is the lesser of the evil, and rather stick to the course of figure out the truth, speak the truth, and then figure out how to practice the truth in a powerful way.
All right. Well, thank you. On that note, I think we will wrap it up here. And it's nice to get back into the groove of things. And it's been an interesting conversation. It hasn't always been a completely completely coherent conversation, but as far as structured. But it's been I'm glad to get our feet back in the water again and really start to and get this out. And so, getting a lot more out here in the future, and hopefully in the next weeks and months, delving into some of these deeper dive topics on these discussions of these topics that we discussed this evening. So thank you again, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And definitely people check out this, just download this report. Even in the next paragraph from where we stopped off reading there is a footnote 4320, where Brittany Kaiser told the committee that while Sam Patton ran the Nigeria-based campaign, Cambridge Analytica may have assisted the client retain former Israeli Mossad agents working in a private capacity to conduct opposition research against the client's political opponent. Okay, and so that, of course, ties into a lot of the stuff that we've dealt with, years ago, actually, in terms of the deep background of Israeli intelligence in African and geopolitics, right? So this is Nigeria, Cambridge Analytica, Israeli Mossad, so there's some stuff here to dig up. So,
yeah, I guess. And one of the major Obama era operations was out of Nigeria. Boko Haram, Save Our Girls. I haven't done a deep dive into that, but it's interesting. Cambridge Analytica was, and Israelis were seriously meddling there. So
that's a good point, Greg.
All right. Well, Jeremy, thanks so much.
Thank you, Greg. All right. Bye-bye. Till next time.